Welcome, everyone. You're listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's edition of Tell Me More Tuesday, we're going to do something a bit different, and I think everybody's going to like this. I'm actually going to have a guest talk about one topic. So rather than hearing me yap away into a microphone about some stuff that I know about, which is great, it's great for me, I like it, we're going to actually have an expert. And our guest today is Nick Bakar, Senior Vice President, Maritime Administration, Regulatory Affairs at International Registries. And he's going to talk with us today about CII. What is it? We're going to explore that a little bit. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you. Thanks.
Really glad to have you here. Just to let everyone know, Nick and I are also, fellow SUNY maritime grads. So I'm just still waiting for Kings Pointers. We have a Texas grad on. We've had some Indian Maritime School grads on. We haven't had a Kings Pointer yet. Waiting for that. Instead of me introducing you, so tell everybody, why are you an expert or have this deep domain knowledge about CII? Tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, no surprise. I would not call myself an expert on this, and I know some others might disagree because of the depth of involvement with this, but I really don't consider myself an expert because I'm not necessarily one of those really, really, really smart people that sort of developed this and were really the visionaries behind getting this off the ground and were able to sort of envision exactly what it is. But my role really, I think, is it's actually kind of interesting. It goes back a ways even to like our time at school and everything like that. It's just career progression. I'm an engineer by background, but at the time when I came over to work with the registry after working at sea, began to get involved in policy development. And what the registry does, what IRI does is it provides the technical administrative support to the Marshall Islands Maritime Program. And so part of that role is also representing the Marshall Islands government at the International Maritime Organization. And for those who don't know, the IMO, for short, is a specialized UN agency that deals specifically with maritime-related treaties, and their objectives are promoting safety, security, and environmental stewardship of the industry. So that's really kind of where it all begins. I began to get involved in the policy development, and I got sort of, because of my engineering background, became very interested and involved in the revisions to MARPOL Annex 6, which began around the time that I started there. That goes back to 2006, when really they were only kind of working on the existing Chapter 3 of MARPOL Annex 6, dealing with the regular, sort of atmospheric pollutants, sulfur oxide, nitrogen oxide emissions, and ozone depleting substances. But one of the things that occurred, again, this is a little bit of a history point here, is that the IMO at some point, when looking at air emissions, also understood the connection between air emissions and carbon, GHG emissions, and the interrelationship between different measures that would reduce some pollutants and also addressing, carbon emissions as well. So the IMO, and also taking into account a lot of different political sort of influences at that time, agreed to address GHG emissions from shipping following three routes. And the idea is to develop technical or design-based measures, operational measures, and then a market or carbon pricing type measure towards addressing emissions from international shipping. The reason MARPOL Annex 6 is used is because it's regulated through those provisions that address air pollution. Also, it's an existing convention, so it's a lot easier to modify an existing convention. Long story short, it all started with technical design requirements, this EEDI, which is sort of a rating for ships based on their existing design efficiency. And at that time, operational measures were not mandatory. There really was obviously there were a lot of different viewpoints with respect to the feasibility of establishing mandatory operational efficiency measures, but obviously time moved on. And what then led to CII in connection with EEXI is this overall strategy that's taking place right now, actually, which was a roadmap that was agreed for developing a comprehensive strategy to reduce GHG emissions from shipping. And part of that strategy involved setting targets, which are these 2030, 2050 targets you hear about sometimes. These are the levels of ambition of the strategy. These are what the different things in the context of the strategy have to achieve. That's your goal. Part of that strategy also was to develop measures on a short, a medium, and a long-term basis. The short-term measures that were developed were according to that initial strategy are intended to be developed and put into place by 2023. And here we are, 2023, right around the corner. And just in time, these are measures that were developed in the context of that strategy, in the context of that roadmap, were a set of goal-based short-term measures, which is a combination of a technical measure to apply to existing ships, not new ships only. That's the EEXI. And then in combination with that, a carbon intensity indicator, which is this framework or this measure that's intended to address operational efficiency of ships. And so that's really what sort of brought this to where we are today.
Certainly it's in the news and there's lots of different views on it, which is we're not going to get into. So one of the ones that you said is the short-term measure is CII, which has been getting a lot of the airplay. As we joked around before we pressed start, one of my favorite movies and one of my favorite lines from movies is Philadelphia, the Denzel Washington, the lawyer that defends Tom Hanks, the character that has HIV/AIDS, who gets fired. It's a very good movie. In case some of the younger folks are listening and haven't seen it, I saw it in the theater. I'm dating myself. He says one thing. He says, well, okay, this is great. Explain this to me like I'm in kindergarten. So for a lot of people who listen to the podcast, maybe you're new to shipping or, don't have a full grasp of this. You see it in a lot of different contexts. Walk us through what CII is, what it's trying to accomplish, kind of how it helps. And again, there's a lot of people who are putting water on the fire and saying, no, this is not good. This is not right. That's not here to debate it because I don't want to take up 6 hours of podcast time in doing that. Nor do I have the expertise. So to walk us through that, I think it's really interesting for people to kind of know really on an elemental level what this is.
Okay, what it is, what it's meant to achieve, and so on and so forth. Right. I think to explain what it is, it's helpful to also look at it in connection with all of the other requirements under Annex 6. Okay, so again, explaining it to a kindergartner, basically what this is these are rules that are essentially, and the official term is called carbon intensity. Okay, it's reducing the carbon intensity of shipping, but the goal of these regulations are to basically sort of push ships to be able to transport cargo more efficiently. In other words, use less fuel to transport the same amount of cargo. Now, the EEDI/EEXI, like I mentioned before, those are design metrics. It's kind of like the MPG rating for your car. Okay, it's sort of establishing minimum thresholds for.
That's a great way to put that. This is how the car is built.
Right, exactly. And that's a technical measure. That's the design measure. And those regulations set what those thresholds need to be based on the ship type, size, and so on and so forth. And without going into the details of how it actually works. But the other side of it is, you have an MPG rating for your car, but as you know, depending on where you live, how you drive the car, whether you're carrying loads of cargo or the car is empty, how you drive the car, how you operate the car, then dictates what your actual emissions are, what your actual miles per gallon rating for that car is. And that's what the CII is aimed at addressing here. It's establishing, again, sort of an index value, an average index value for certain ship types and sizes to sort of set like a benchmark or set a target. And then based on how the ship is operated, how much fuel it's using for the amount of time and distance that it's traveled, and we won't get into those intricacies either, but based on those metrics, it then sort of comes up with this metric for efficiency, which is the CII rating. So again, all of these factors come into play. for determining your CII rating, and then it has to improve. So those targets get more and more stringent from year to year. Now, in terms of also talking about its effects, I mean, clearly, I think the objectives here are pretty obvious. It's it's setting these targets, and it's setting sort of ratings for ships that have to sort of meet over time and continue to improve over time. I'm aware of a lot of the different views that are about its efficacy and things like that. But something that's important to remember and I'll address that. I mean, an important thing to sort of address about the criticisms of it is that you have to remember this CII framework was accepted as a package of measures. So it was accepted as a package along with the EEXI. Also, it was developed through the IMO processes, which, even though there are provisions in conduct IMO meetings for things to go to votes or to be able to take decisions based on majority minority, really when it comes to significant decisions, the IMO as an organization, the member states of the IMO strive towards coming to decisions by consensus. This is a result of sort of a consensus-based approach to get an agreement on a measure to put in place now. And there's a lot of different trade-offs that went into sort of coming to that decision. One thing was, like, conceptually, the idea of the CII it really was conceptually developed as sort of a fleet averaging approach. And there wasn't a lot of sort of clarity in terms of how taking this fleet averaging approach to benchmark efficiency would really work on an individual ship basis. Also, there's, again, part of the compromise to all this is that there's a review provision built into this. So, obviously for the next few years, the regulated community is going to be looking really closely at the effects of this to see whether the effects are adequate or not, whether they're in line with the targets of the strategy. Because remember, this was developed in the context of the IMO GHG strategy. So they got to make sure it's actually delivering in terms of the results. But also, it also has different other principles built into it. One is that there's really not a punitive aspect to this. Now, that does draw some criticism in some respects, but that also is important to give the flexibility to be able to evaluate the performance and effectiveness of the measure itself as you obviously continue to move towards more and more stringent targets as well. Plus, there's all sorts of little things in there, like there's provisions for encouraging member states to establish incentives for higher performing vessels, and as you know, it works on a rating. If you're right where you need to be, you're average, you're C, but you can perform better, or you might perform worse. So, right. All of these factors kind of came in together, and the takeaway from all that, I like to say, is that some will say that the sign of a true consensus is that nobody's happy coming away from it, right? So, and I think here, it doesn't mean it's a failure of the process. It just means there were a lot of concessions from a lot of different directions to kind of come up with something so that we could have something in place in time for the timeframes of a short-term measure by 2023. Don't forget as well, these are really unique regulations in the sense that they were developed during the pandemic. So they were developed during a time through correspondence, through virtual meetings, without the normal efficiencies of working face-to-face, especially in multilateral negotiations that take place at the IMO. So there's, like I say, I think I'm saying this to kind of, give it a little break in that sense. Yeah.
No, so I have a few background. One is the thing about consensus, that when I was a shipbroker, we would say something similar. And if you didn't annoy somebody, we use a different word. That means you weren't doing your job. And we used a different terminology, but basically sometimes in order to get a deal done, you have to give something up, and you're going to go, well, I gave this up. Yeah, but you got this over here. And that's only bilateral, right? That's a charter, that's a cargo owner and a ship owner. I mean, that's it. Here you got times 30, which makes it certainly cumbersome. And I think one of the things, again, as an outside observer, not as a ship owner, not as a cargo owner, as an industry observer, somebody that's been around for a little bit, I look at this and what the IMO is doing as you're putting a flag down. Okay. And it's not perfect, right? But if you don't have a goal you're never going to get started because you'll never get out of the gate.
Right.
And I look at it a lot as to kind of what the agile philosophy, and the agile philosophy is you throw something out there. Yeah, we kind of got this right. We got the design right. We know we want to go east. Are we going southeast? As long as we're not going west, as long as we're not going backwards. I think, the whole idea is you get it out there, you get it in the hands of the community to use it to get feedback, and eventually you're going to go in the right direction. You're going to be in the general right direction. You're going to be going east, but really we want to go southeast. Okay, you're going to have to take some adjustments. And this sounds like you have this period of adjustment and review and stuff like that. And I also think what's interesting is that those goals are being, and this is, maybe gets into too deep, those goals are being used by other organizations, such as the Poseidon Principles, such as Sea Cargo Charter, such as the Poseidon Principles for Insurance. These are all things that are starting to use that as a goalpost to kind of enact, putting the money where the mouth is, and it's almost de facto a regulatory penalty, not really, but it's a monetary penalty if you don't make those goals. So
yeah,
I think it's, look, if otherwise you'll just, you'll have paralysis by analysis, right? And sometimes you just got to get it out there. Again, I'm sure people will look at this, Chris, you don't own ships, you don't move cargo anymore, you're not even a broker, you can't do that anymore. So I'm here on the sidelines, and yeah, you could say that, but I think sometimes you just have to get things going, and it sounds like you guys are. As we recording this, Nick is getting on a plane soon to go into some of these IMO meetings. Can you talk a little bit about what's in the future, or kind of where you stand, or that's off limits, which is fine too. But where do you see? I think this is meeting 79, and then you have 80 and 81. Where do you see this morphing to as we get closer, and then eventually into the enforcement of the regulations?
Oh no, certainly. I mean, I can speak to it in general terms. I mean, the only thing I guess we can't really go into are the specifics of positions and things like that. But that's exactly right. Next week there's an intersessional working group on GHG emissions. This is the 13th session of this particular working group. This working group is a subsidiary body of the MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee, which is then meeting the week after. Now, the MEPC is the principal committee at the IMO that oversees the MARPOL Convention. And not just the MARPOL Convention, but also other environmental conventions like Ballast Water Convention, Anti-Fouling Systems Convention, things like that. But so it's the MEPC that has the responsibility, or has been given the responsibility, to develop, to not only oversee this strategy, but also to develop the various measures in that context. The next intersessional meeting is obviously just carrying forward a lot more work that's been going on for the last few years. And the intersessional meeting is then going to feed into the MEPC itself. Now, a couple of interesting things about the next 2 weeks are that these are going to be the first two meetings of both of these bodies in person since the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the working arrangements up until now have been through the virtual meeting arrangements, which it is what it is. Basically, it was a stopgap measure. Things didn't completely shut down, but they weren't necessarily ideal. As you know, it's certainly a lot better being able to come to agreements on things and come to deals when you can look the other person in the eye. And there's all these other things that go into this. And so one thing's going to be interesting about it is that it's certainly going to be a period or an opportunity for both the committee and this intersessional meeting to catch up. So to kind of be able to sort of bring things a little bit better on track, even though they've, in my opinion, I think they've done a very good job sort of keeping things moving forward, at least with respect to the agenda item dealing with GHG emissions. The other thing is that what I mentioned at the beginning of our recording here is that we talked about IMO's roadmap, and so it's this roadmap is just this sort of agreed timetable by which the IMO would develop an initial strategy, collect data on fuel consumption from certain ships using the DCS regulations, and then develop short-term measures, and then work on developing a revision to that strategy. Now, 2020. Now, this upcoming MEPC 79 is going to be important. It's going to be like stage setting more than anything else. I don't think you're necessarily going to see any significant decisions, even though that there are, obviously there's a huge interest and huge amounts of pressure to see progress in a lot of different areas. But the thing to remember is that according to this roadmap, 2023 is really the pivotal year. So there's one MEPC meeting in 2023. That's MEPC 80, the one after this one. And that's the one where the revised strategy is set to be agreed and adopted. And one of the major issues, one of the huge things that they're going to be looking at next week, the week after, and in the run up to MEPC 80 are the strengthening of that strategy, the strengthening of those targets. So we talked about the targets, levels of ambition, the 2030, 2050 targets. There's going to be obviously a great deal of work that's going to go into revising those targets and developing more stringent targets. Many countries, of course, advocating for setting targets for the shipping sector to be consistent with a trajectory in line with the 1.5 degree temperature limits of the Paris Agreement. What that means is that can mean different things to different people, but what it basically means is looking at, for example, zero emissions by 2050 rather than the 50% emissions by 2050 where it's currently at. And of course, that's going to have a huge impact on the measures that are then developed in that context, because those measures have to meet those new, more stringent targets. The other thing, obviously, that is also happening at MEPC 80 in 2023 will be when that revised strategy is adopted. In conjunction with that strategy, the mid and long-term measures also have to be agreed. So again, doesn't mean that those requirements or whatever those measures are going to become a requirement for you now. It just means that the committee is going to decide, okay, this is how we're going to approach midterm, this is how we're going to approach long-term, and then from that point on begin to develop the timeframes for implementing those. But even that in and of itself is going to be a huge decision. Again, trying to bring all this together, there's different approaches and there's a lot of different things going on. Like if you look at carbon pricing, for example, what's going on in the EU with the emissions trading approach versus a carbon levy approach that's proposed by other countries. And clearly this gets very complicated. It gets once money becomes involved, it becomes sort of an elevated sense of importance, and it's also very political as well, which is another thing that's a bit unique for the IMO. The IMO is a technical body, really. It normally develops technical standards. So now you have to deal with and you have to address sort of the political viewpoints that a lot of countries or member states, I should say, are bringing into the discussions as well. So it's it's going to be a lot of fun.
Maybe after MEPC 80, we'll have you on and we could talk about what came out of that. If you're still in a talking mood at that point next year sometimes. But, going back really quick and then we'll wrap up. But I've always been an advocate of, I think the IMO and the EU and the US, they're going to put stakes in the sand and and I think that's a good starting point. But I think that things will be accelerated by what you said with money. And I think a little bit with things like Poseidon Principles, as well as consumers getting on people to say, I will spend more money for this glassware, if I know the ship is emitting, if the carbon footprint is lower, I'll spend. Right. And if you look at it, like if you break down a container and how much, you actually say by having, cleaner fuels or cleaner ship, cost of a glass is cents. It's not, because you're hauling so much cargo. And it's the same thing for other things. I did it once with bananas. It's like 2 cents a banana or a pound. I mean, it's not a big thing in terms of money, but I think that the consumers are going to drive a lot of this. That's what I think. And that may be, okay, great. IMO says something, we can do better than that. And you're seeing that with some of the companies, which is great, but you have to start someplace. And I think that, what you're doing is certainly at least putting sticks in the sand to try to meet. You go past it, great. If you can't get there, how do you adjust and why? What's going on? What's different? What was not anticipated? But it sounds like that you're moving right along. Nick, you gave us a great amount of insight. I want to thank you. For all my listeners, this is usually a 5 to 10 minute thing. This is a lot longer, but I think we got a great amount of don't apologize. This is fantastic. This is perfectly timely. Because we have obviously the regulations coming up, obviously the meetings coming up. And then, like you said, ahead of next year's pivotal 80. And I didn't know this myself, how pivotal next year's meeting will be and all the press and everything. I wish you the best of luck. And good luck heading over this afternoon and safe travels. And we'll talk to you in the future. Thanks a lot for coming on, Nick. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Great to talk with you. And as always,
Once again, that was Nick McCarr, Senior Vice President, Maritime Administration, Regulatory Affairs at International Registries, Marshall Island Flag. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Tell Me More Tuesday. My goal is to do more of these interviews with experts on specific topics, including having experts in the digital technology space, keeping in theme with the show. Please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe to the podcast. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Aversano, wishing you fair winds and following seas.